here, and I'm no longer fooling you now, we're now back to doing this straight, which is how I try to do my science. What we've got here is 3 parallel trend lines. That means that the rate of warming in each of those 3 periods was the same. This third period here is more or less coincident with the yellow graph we saw earlier, back here. You see, more or less the same. And what their graph concealed, this is another reason why we know their graph is bogus, is that there were 2 previous periods in the record when you had warming at the same rate. And not particularly terrifying, 1/6 of a Celsius per decade. That's the maximum rate of warming sustained for more than a decade in the entire 155-year record. I've cherry-picked these 3 because that's what I wanted to see. What's the fastest rate of warming I can find? You might have read your New Zealand Herald this morning. You would have seen them saying, oh, this man Monckton, he cherry-picks his data, you know, to make his case. What they don't tell you is that I cherry-picked the highest rates of warming in the data because I wanted to learn whether it had happened before, which it has, twice. I then got the BBC to ask Dr. Jones at the University of East Anglia, who's on the other side of the case, whether I was correct when I had calculated, because I didn't just do it by putting it on the graph, I calculated it from the underlying data, that the 3 rates of warming were within the statistical error margin the same. And to the horror of the BBC, he said, yes, they are. And he said, this one, fractionally more. But it's so little you can't actually tell that it's significant. So there you are. And we could have influenced this one, but we couldn't have influenced the previous 2. And yet this one is not significantly steeper than the previous 2. So there has been no acceleration in global warming. We'll come to the 5th assessment report, and this is the one that's just about to come out. And I was horrified when I saw this graph. Now this graph is what's called a spaghetti graph. It's not actually drawn by children, though the conclusion it comes to might have been reached by children, because no adult could possibly have reached it. And it's lovely colours, she says. Oh, madam, you've got a real friend in the IPCC now, they'll love you. Lovely colours, quite right. It is actually quite pretty, in a sort of childish, scribbly sort of way. And the interesting thing about this graph is that it is the projections under various scenarios of how much CO2 we emit, so that you get various so-called radiative forcing, over the next 40 years. But these projections were made this year by suites of up to 40 models, 38 models I think. And the question is, do you notice something odd about this prediction that was made this year? Anybody know? It starts exactly in 2005. It starts 8 years before the present. Now, why do they do this? They do this because it's called a training period. You want to make sure that the models are kind of doing it right before you carry on with the rest of the prediction. But the honourable gentleman here, who gets 10 merit points, has immediately cut to the chase. He has seen that what they've done is they haven't trained it correctly. Look at that period of 8 years, we already know what's happened. The black is the real world data. And the rest is the fiction the models are predicting. Now, what should happen, if they'd done the training period correctly, is that the model's predictions should have fallen either side of the real world data, which should go through the middle. But the real world data is where it is, and all of their projections are way, way too high. I mean, seriously too high. You know, look at it. Half a Celsius to a Celsius, too high, just over an 8-year period, which has already happened. That's how bad this is. Now, let me show you what the effect of this is on the rest of the prediction. You see, that's what they wanted to publish. I'm trying to stop them, but I don't think I'll succeed. This is what they should have done. They should have started from where we actually are. And you see the difference that makes. Even if you use the same kind of general slope of their forecast as I have. I don't think that slope is correct. It's not going anything like as high as that, but let's pretend. But it's still so much less drastic if you do it correctly than if you don't. So they're still at it, tampering with the temperature record, as they have in all 4 previous assessment reports. They still haven't learned that bogus science in the long run does not pay. So what is really happening to global temperature? This is the question we've got to ask. And you see, this is not a matter of belief, ladies and gentlemen. It's a matter of measurement. You can't take a vote on what global temperature is. Well, you can if you're the IPCC, but in the real world we use thermometers. either down here on Earth or mounted on satellites, which are the more accurate ones. And here at Doha, at the climate conference of the UN, 194 nations were represented. I went as an observer. They let me in this time, but never again, because I did what an observer shouldn't do. Right at the end of the conference, I had gone into the plenary session hall an hour before everybody else because I wanted to sit down, take the weight off my aging feet and read some of the conference documentation to see if I could find the final statement and put it out. But they very carefully don't do a final statement anymore because they don't want the likes of me actually reading it. They've learned that one from the Durban conference. Anyway, I was reading some of the other papers, and the room filled up around me. The conference started. It was a very short session. People had their last chance to have their say. And eventually the chairman said, is there anybody else from a group who wants to say anything? And nobody did. And this microphone was just there because I'd sat in one of the delegates' chairs because it was comfortable, and I was happy to be thrown out if he came along, but this was a delegate from Burma. He must have been still partying in the souk somewhere, so I just sat tight. There was his microphone. Nobody wanted to say anything, so I'm afraid I was very naughty. I just went. And the chair recognised the delegation from Burma, and I was on. So I said, look, there's been no global warming for 16 years, I said. And there was fury. Not because I wasn't from Burma. The chairman of the conference could see perfectly well I wasn't from... Do I look Burmese? And of course, when I spoke, it was kind of apparent I wasn't from Burma either. Beautiful Cambridge accent. But I said there'd been no global warming for 16 years. How of rage? Not because I wasn't from Burma, they hadn't really worked that out yet. But because I had farted in front of them. I had said there's been no global warming for 16 years. Now, how did I know that? I knew it by measurement and calculation. There are 5 separate global temperature data sets available to me, 3 terrestrial ones and 2 satellite ones. I had calculated on each of them the least squares linear regression trend on the data going back 16 years, and had determined that in each case the trend was less than 0.05 Celsius of warming. 0.05, or a 20th of a Celsius degree, is the measurement uncertainty in all of these data sets, because you can never quite measure things accurately. And therefore, the warming that was evident in each of these data sets over 16 years was not statistically distinguishable from 0. So I said there's been no global warming at all for 16 years. Fury, pandemonium, hoots, boos, hisses, catcalls. It was like a crowd of teenagers at a pop concert who'd been told that Justin Dribbler wasn't going to appear. Fury. So then I went and checked. And in fact, there's been no global warming on the Hadley Centre to record. That's the one that the UN uses for 18 or 19 years, depending on which of the data sets you use. And on the RSS satellite data set, 23 years. No global warming, statistically distinguishable from 0. Not one of the models predicted that. This is completely unexpected. They did not expect it. I did not expect it. If you add CO2 to the atmosphere, you would expect to get some warming. That's the way it works, ladies and gentlemen. Get used to it. But we haven't had any. So obviously, therefore, there is some natural influence, a decline in solar activity, the fact that there was a very big peak in the record in 1998, even though I was going back to 1996 here, that would have distorted things. There are various reasons why it might have sort of concealed the fact that there's a little bit of warming going on. What isn't happening is there isn't a lot of warming going on. And therefore, the predictions that there was going to be a lot of warming going on have simply failed. The consensus has been wrong and wrong again. Yes, of course.
Has there been a decline in temperature at all during this period?
Well, yeah, of course, it jiggles up and down.
Yeah.
And so it depends on the period you take. You see, the honourable gentleman over there earlier said, oh, but you know, we're on a rising trend. And if you go back to, say, 1950 or 1900 or even 1850, you are on a rising trend. You go back to, shall we say, the Holocene climate optimum, and we've had 8,000 years of global cooling. It depends on the period you take. But what had been predicted by the UN's climate panel was that there should be now, they said this in 1990, there should be a rate of global warming equivalent to 0.3 Celsius per decade. That was their central estimate. 0.2 at minimum, 0.5 at maximum, 0.3 was their central estimate. It hasn't been happening. In fact, if you go all the way back to 1950, the rate of warming since 1950 is really very small. And I'm going to come to that in a moment, but first, In Melbourne, just 3 weeks ago, railroad engineer Rajendra Pachauri, who for some unfathomable reason is the climate science head of the UN's climate panel, you couldn't make this up, ladies and gentlemen. You know, he could tell you instantly what the lateral acceleration on a 40-ton locomotive accelerating at 25 miles an hour around a 22-chain curve is. But he's now trying to tell us about global warming. And it's a strange thing, but what he has said, and this carries the official sanction of the UN's climate panel, there's been no global warming for 17 years. It has paused, he said. And only one news medium in Australia was willing to report this, because it doesn't fit the Communist Party line. So it's not me cherry-picking, as the Herald tried to say this morning. It is railroad engineer Pachauri, temporarily out of his signal box and talking the truth. 17 years, pause in global warming. And all four of the previous IPCC reports got this wrong. Ignore the grey, which is a mistake in their printing, but this is the official graph from them. The only thing I've added to it is the trend line. The actual data, the black data, that's the real world data, that's on their graph. I put the trend line on, and as you can see, the trend is not where they said it was going to go. It's right along the bottom. So the consensus was not just wrong right at the outset in 1990, it has been wrong in every report since. And on that bogus graph we've just seen from the forthcoming report, it's going to be wrong a fifth time over. They do not learn. And here's the credibility gap. 1 Celsius of warming per century is the rate equivalent since 1950. It works out at about 1.2 Celsius per century. But they're predicting nearly 3 Celsius per century as their central estimate. What are they on? I want some. Look at that huge discrepancy between what's been observed now for 63 years and what they're predicting for the next 90. It's clearly nonsense. It's even more clearly nonsense if you look at the Gillard credibility gap. The Garner report says it bases its calculations on 6 Celsius of warming over the next 100 years, of which minus 0.1 Celsius has happened in the first 1/12 of the century that they're making the prediction for. So again, a huge credibility gap, and you do not need to be a climate scientist or any kind of an expert to see that they do now have a rather serious problem with what they've been predicting. In fact, this is what it looks like. 16 years without global warming. I'm grateful to the Global Warming Policy Foundation for drawing it this way. That graph is terrifying, ladies and gentlemen. Terrifying, that is, if you've been predicting doom and gloom, and you now see in this very graphical form that it simply isn't happening. And they've got it wrong in the oceans too. We now have 3,500 bathythermograph buoys going down to depths of 2,000 metres and coming back and doing complete temperature and salinity profiles all the way. That's still only the equivalent of taking one sample of temperature and salinity in the whole of Lake Superior less than once a year. But it's a better record than we've had before, and it doesn't show the increase in ocean heat content which you have seen reported recently by the likes of James Hansen. The actual measurements don't show it. The models over-predicted this 4.5 times over. Now the models are also overstating the bad consequences of warming. We're going to look at this now. Sea level, that's the big one. This is the big scare. You've got it here, you've got the sea coming in close. Ooh, we're all going to be washed away, and Bob Brown of the Greens in Tasmania will be one of the first to go, even if he is on the first floor. But fortunately it isn't going to happen, because here is the raw data. And you notice how I prefer to look at the raw data before I start tampering with it, or looking at anybody else's tampering with it. The actual data measured by satellite altimetry, by the Aviso Envisat satellite. This is the entire 8-year record, and this is their graph, and it is their trend line. I've decorated it by putting it in green, but it's their trend line. And it's their figure up there to show what the slope is. 0.32 millimetres per year, which is equivalent to 3.2 centimetres per century. That's the rate at which sea level was rising over the last 8 years. Not enough even to cover me spat, don't you know? It's not happening as they said. And this man has been investigating sea level for 40 years. He's the world's greatest expert in it, Professor Niklas Mörner of the University of Stockholm. Wonderful guy. I could tell you a lot of stories about him, but there isn't time today. Just tell you this one, though. He has been looking at the Maldives, where the dictator recently held a cabinet meeting underwater. to draw attention to global warming, this new game they all play among the governing class. And there's been no global warming in the Maldives for the last 1260 years, 1250 years. So there's no need for them to hold their cabinet meetings on board. If you happen to know of a Pacific island which is worried about sinking beneath the waves because of global warming and rising sea levels, let me know. I'll pay them $1 for it. Myrna was walking along the seafront, on the seashore, I should say, in the Maldives the other day. He saw this tree lying on the ground, but still in leaf. He stood it up and photographed it. That's what you see here. He went to the local pub and said, "What's going on? Did the sea rise?" You can see the shoreline just there. "And swamp it and knock it over?" "Oh no," they said, "that was done by a group of Australian environmentalists. They saw that that tree, it had taken 40 years to grow to this height. They saw that tree had been there for 40 years or so. They realised that the sea level had been, the coast had been there also for 40 years. I've been here 60 years, the coast had always been just there where it is now. So there had been no sea level rise, and that tree was the living proof of it. So he said they pushed it over so that nobody would know, just their bad luck that you came along 2 days later." And the extent and trend of global sea ice. You hear an awful lot about this. And isn't it interesting how often you hear that the Arctic sea ice is melting? But it's the Antarctic, last time I looked. And the sea ice there has been growing because it's been cooling for 33 years, ever since the satellites have been watching in Antarctica. There's been no such thing as global warming yet. Because until Antarctica starts warming, then you can't call it global. So the extent and trend of global sea ice are not terribly exciting. This is compiled by the University of Illinois. A little bit of a decline in the trend in the last few years, but well within natural variability. There's nothing there that's unusual. I haven't tampered with this graph. That's their graph. And here is an explorer, a once famous explorer, Sir Ranulph Twistleton Wickham Fiennes. Silly name, silly man. Because what he did was he decided that to draw attention to global warming, just like the dictator of the Maldives, he would go for a walk across Antarctica in the winter. He'd chosen the one continent where there's been no warming at all for the last 33 years. It's been cooling so rapidly that, according to Doran et al. 2002, there's been real environmental damage in the Antarctic glens caused by the regional cooling. And just in case you're wondering whether the cooling was caused by global warming, step back a bit and think about that statement. No, it isn't. The UN Climate Panel, for which I may have pointed out I'm an expert reviewer, says that if you get more warm weather, you will expect less snow, less cold weather. It kind of follows, doesn't it? But you'll still find that the Russians this year, who had their coldest winter in 100 years, are saying this is because of global warming. Hello? So he got frostbite and had to come back. He didn't complete the trip. He was only there for a few days and was beaten back by the intense cold that he hadn't known about, because he had read stuff from the Greens, he'd read stuff from the newspapers, he'd listened to the BBC, which is a remarkably stupid thing to do, and he got frostbite for his pains. It's much better to do what I do and read the actual scientific papers and download the data for yourself and have a look at it. Here, for instance, is North American snow cover. Does that look like a declining trend to you? It is, of course, a rising trend. And global, Northern Hemisphere snow cover, extensive global, it's of course just the Northern Hemisphere, reached its highest level in the December record in December of last year, 2012, just a few months ago. And in fact, more recently, we've now had the figures for December, January, February, which are the Northern Hemisphere winter, and it's the fourth highest total snowfall in the Northern Hemisphere since the satellite record began 33 years ago. So just in case you think that a drought in New Zealand is somehow an evidence of global warming, there is one indication that this is not global. Here is 8,000 years of Greenland temperatures from the top of the Greenland ice shelf. Now, there's been a series of papers showing this. It's not new. Well, this particular one is new. It came out just a few weeks ago. But what it shows is that the temperature on the top of Greenland is 2.5 Celsius greater 8,000 years ago than it is today. And yet all the ice on Greenland that was there then is still there now. It didn't melt because the thermal inertia of ice is enormous. And just because you get even 2.5 Celsius of warming persisting as it did then for 4,000 years, higher than today, that was not enough to overcome the thermal inertia of the ice on Greenland and make it melt significantly. A little bit around the edges, no doubt, but certainly not the main sheet. So we know from that that it's not going to happen now if we put the temperatures up, even if we put them up by that amount, which I don't think we will. Rainfall, I know, has been something on your minds recently here in New Zealand. So I thought I would go back and find the earliest, longest rainfall record I could. 247 years, rainfall in England and Wales, 1765 to 2012. And what you'll see there is that there is an uptrend, but it's only of 2 inches or 5 centimetres more on average per year now than it was 247 years or a quarter of a millennium ago, well within the natural variability of the climate. Now, I had to calculate that because nobody had ever done it before. I got the data from the Met Office, I did the sums, that's the answer. It's not, of course, a very close correlation. It's the best we can do with the data. But it is not a picture of a deteriorating situation, either of too much or of too little rain. It's a picture of very little change indeed. And then there's methane, the cow fart tax, as Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin calls it. No need for it, because methane stopped rising in about the year 2000, because Gaz Putin had gone along with his duct tape and his chewing gum, blocking up all the holes in the badly engineered Soviet pipeline that takes methane all the way from Siberia to Europe. And so the methane stopped rising, and that caught the UN's climate panel by surprise 4 times. There are the 4 red, blue, green and yellow, the 4 IPCC previous reports and their projections of where methane would go. There is what it's actually done. And you may say, have I made this up? No, they did. Because this is their graph from the 2013 draft report. It's on page 793 or somewhere. I don't know exactly what page, it's somewhere back there. I'm trying to get them to pull it towards the front of the book, because there is no basis for going against farmers for producing stock. So don't let the Greens bully you about methane. It is not rising significantly. Now you might say, how much is it rising? Here you are. This is your own record from Baring Head, New Zealand. And what it shows is that between 2000 and 2009, I haven't been able to get an updated record yet, I am working on it, it rose by so little that that would cause a warming of 1/350th of a Celsius degree. So that shows that methane simply isn't a problem anymore. So when you see all this kind of stuff being done by your bureaucrats here, this is a New Zealand graph from one of your Whangos, and what it is showing is that all the CO2 coming in and out, respiration, urine, feces, milk, meat, human respiration and waste. Look at it all. To try to excuse and give a reason for bullying farmers in New Zealand. All of this, there's one word for that, and you'll see it spelt out on the screen. And then, of course, you've had your drought, haven't you? It's broken now, certainly further north of here. It may not have broken here yet, but it will do. And they say that this extreme weather, this drought, you've had Jim Salinger writing in the papers excitingly, they don't ask any questions, these papers, they're so deadly. And he said, oh, this is all because of global warming, that you've had a drought, worse than any drought you've had before. Actually, it's about the same as 3 previous droughts, but that's what the storyline is. So let's have a look at what's going on here. Extreme weather is not the new normal, it's the old normal and the new slogan. The old slogans have all failed. Global warming, well, it hasn't done that for 17 years, according to the UN climate panel. So they've scrubbed that one. Then they tried climate change. Trouble is that climate's been changing for 4,567 million years since that Tuesday on which the first wisps of the atmosphere formed. Madam, how do I know that it was a Tuesday? I don't, I made it up. So they scrubbed that. And then climate disruption. And nobody knew what the heck that meant. But then they found the answer, extreme weather. And look at the fun they're having with that. Let's have a look at some of the fun they're having with this. Here, for instance, is Jim Salinger's graph, excitedly reproduced in the New Zealand Herald, champion of the global warming cause. And it shows a record soil moisture deficit, which is the official drought measure. And you see that's the little bar for this year, 2012 to 13 summer, just by me here. But you'll see that there are a couple of other seriously heavy droughts earlier in the record. So there's nothing particularly special about this one. That's the first thing you notice. But there's something else you notice when you look at this graph. It is not scientifically presented because there are no uncertainty margins or error whiskers or measurement uncertainty bars. you just get the straight data. Now that's not good enough. The other thing you don't get is a trend line to find out whether what we've seen so far is a rising trend of soil moisture deficit or a falling one. It is actually a rising one, but not exactly by very much. I had to calculate this because he hadn't done it, because he's not doing science, he's doing propaganda. And so it is a trend, it's an uptrend of around 5 millimetres every 10 years, or half a millimetre a year over the entire record. This is not really very much, and again it's probably within the measurement uncertainty in the data, but I don't know, because he has not very helpfully not supplied what the measurement uncertainty in the data is. Because he didn't want, presumably, somebody like me coming along and doing this calculation and then saying, well, it's not significant. It probably isn't very significant, even if it's significant at all. And then, of course, without blushing, they suddenly say, oh, right, well, the Kerry flood, just down the road, that was caused by global warming, except that you can see that it happened first in 1883. Heavy rain all day and night, the Kerry River, higher than any I've seen it, lowlands covered with water, rushing through the paddock, washing away fences. 1883, Nancy picked me out in her diary. And then, here's a picture of it. And this was in 1981. And notice that building there. We're going to look at it from a different angle now. There's the picture, slightly out of focus for something, in the Kerry Business Association's pamphlet for 1981, showing this 81 flood. And it's actually from just to the left of that oval there, this picture was taken. But now look closely, ladies and gentlemen, at the screen. Because there in 2007, there was another flood. But do you notice that the New Zealand Historic Places Trust, and what they know about global warming could be written on a postage stamp, have used the picture from 1981 and yet said that that applied to the flood in 2007. And you'll find this kind of bogosity goes right through the public services here in New Zealand. They're all at it. And this is what the New Zealand global warming said. The 2007 Kerry flood painted a picture from 1981 of how vulnerable our heritage is to the effect of global warming. How did they know that this flood had anything to do with global warming, given that a flood of the same kind had happened in 1981, because they showed a picture of that, they labelled it 2007, and it also happened in 1883. There is no way of distinguishing which flood has been caused by global warming and which hasn't. And we're going to look at that again a bit later on in Australia too. This is the Stuffham report, produced by the Climate Commissariat of Australia. And it's called The Angry Summer, and it came out a couple of weeks ago. And what it shows was that in Australia this summer, just when you were having your drought, they were having some of the hottest weather ever recorded, 123 hot weather, and of course also wet weather records were set just in 90 days. And Stuffham himself came out and he said, I can tell you, I'm Professor Stuffham, I know this stuff, I'm a climate commissar, I'm telling you that this is all because of global warming. But not all of the journalists are supine. One of them said to him, excuse me, Professor Stuffham, but there's a problem, you see, because Monckton's been going around saying there hasn't been any warming for up to 23 years. And even railroad engineer Pachori is saying there hasn't been any for 17 years, so can you tell me how global warming that hasn't happened could have caused the drought and floods that have? And he said, oh, well, of course, no global warming for 17 years, that's far too short a period to tell what's happening to global warming. And so he can do it just from 90 days. And this is why nobody now takes these people seriously. Because it is as stupid as that. And even the journalists, and my goodness, they've been in attack for this rubbish, even they are beginning to wake up for this. Not all of them can go on keeping a straight face while they pretend there's a problem with the climate, when idiots like this are saying stupid things like this. At one moment saying we can tell from a 90-day period that it's global warming, and yet Monckton can't tell from a 17-year period that there hasn't been any. I mean, what is he on? So, I thought I'd have a look at this 90-day period and see whether I could find any records on the other side of the world where it's winter, and it's been quite a bad one, where records were set in the other direction. I thought I would try and find a landmass, but same size as Australia. Where might I choose in the Northern Hemisphere?
Europe.
The United States. All right, we'll choose the US. There seems to be a vote for that. Here it is. You've got it right again. And in 1 week during that 90-day period, 652 snowfall and extreme cold records, high snowfall and extreme cold records, were set just in the United States alone. Now, I am not going to argue to you from that this heralds the beginning of a new ice age, or that global cooling has now set in forever, and there's no such thing as global warming. But if I'm not going to, then he certainly shouldn't be arguing that this is global warming when he's only got 123 records set over 90 days, when I've got 652 in the other direction in just 7 days. And here, in fact, is the Australian summer temperature, excluding Tasmania. This is measured by the UAH satellites using some of the most accurate thermometers in the world, platinum resistance thermometers. And they have a reference thermometer which points to outer space to measure the temperature of the cosmic background radiation. Anybody know what that temperature is? 2.73 Kelvin, quite right. It's just about absolute zero, it's a little bit above. It's about 1/100th of the freezing point of water. It's very cold. And they use that as their reference temperature, and then they point the other end of the thermometer downwards to measure global temperature on Earth. It's a highly accurate method. And they say that this was not overall a record summer for Australia, but the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, in red against the blue there, has other ideas. And let's have a look at some other extreme weather. All these hurricanes we keep hearing about. But in fact, Sandy was a freak, it wasn't even a hurricane. Bofa, even with these, the combined frequency, intensity and duration of the hurricanes and tropical cyclones and typhoons all around the world, combined into a 24-month running sum by my good friend Dr. Ryan Maui of Florida State University, shows something like the lowest hurricane activity worldwide in the entire instrumental record going back with the satellites for 33 years. In Eastern Australia, the record goes back for recently. Here is the graph from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology just before they destroyed it. I got a copy of it so that we could see these embarrassing records from further back. On either side of the elegant Viscount's coronet there, you will see 8 major floods, defined by the BOM as major, not my definition, theirs. I'm using everybody else's data here. I'm Mr. Nice Guy. And what it shows is 8 major floods, 2 of which were real lulus. The flood of 1840, which is why they started keeping the flood records, and another one in 1893, which I showed you the picture there. 8 of them. But in the period almost twice as long since, there has only been 3 major floods as defined by the BOM, and none of them anything like as big as the floods of 1840 and 1893. And whatever else this is, ladies and gentlemen, it is not a picture of a deteriorating flooding situation on the Brisbane River caused by global warming or anything else, now is it? And this just in from the Holy See. I couldn't resist putting it in. And so now, why are the computer models getting it so wrong? And here I'm going to issue an equation alert. If anyone wants to go out and take a smoke before question time, now's a good time if you don't like equations. I'm going to do the work for you, but it is going to be slightly heavily mathematical. And the reason I do this is there's always a few real scientists in an audience like this. I've detected 1 or 2 already. And they like a bit more meat than just showing you on the record that things haven't happened as they said. And so I'm now going to give you just a little bit of meat. And we're going to start by the observation that it is generally agreed among all parties, over on the left there in blue, that if you add CO2 to the atmosphere, the direct warming that will cause will be around 1 Celsius. Some say a bit less, some say a bit more. The central estimate of the IPCC is 1.16 Celsius per doubling of CO2, just as a direct effect from the CO2. And I'm not going to argue with that, but broadly speaking, all agree it's going to be there or in that ballpark. But then there's a divergence. We skeptics say it's not going to get any more than that, really. It's going to be about the same. But, of course, if it's about the same, 1.2 Celsius of warming over 150 years, that's how long it will take us to double CO2 compared with today at present trends. Only half of that warming would come through in that 150 years. So we'd be looking at 0.6 Celsius of warming over 150 years, and the other 0.6 coming through in the following 1,000. Not exactly a problem. You can't get grants if that's all the problem is. So they had to ramp it up. And they ramped it up by introducing the concept of a climate feedback. Now these feedbacks do exist. They are real. What we don't know is how big they are, because all of their values are unknown and unknowable. We cannot establish their values by any theoretical method. We cannot measure any of them. We cannot distinguish any of them from each other by measurement. We cannot distinguish any of them even from the forcings, the direct influences on changing temperature that triggered the warming, that triggered the feedbacks. All of this is guesswork. And yet, as you can see, it is these feedbacks that dominate the final climate sensitivity equation, which simply said, how much warming are you going to get if you double the CO2 in the atmosphere? And 2/3 of that warming that the UN's climate panel imagines will happen does not come directly from CO2. It comes from these temperature feedbacks, such as they say that if there is a warmer space occupied by the atmosphere, then that space can carry near exponentially more water vapour. And they're right. It's one of the few proven results in climatology. What we don't know is just because it can carry more, whether it actually does. That's an open question. And we can't measure the concentration of water vapour in the atmosphere as we can CO2, because CO2 is uniformly distributed at about the same concentration. It varies by 5% up or down on the average globally at every altitude and latitude. But water vapour isn't like that, so we can't measure it. And we don't know whether this feedback that they say is going to help to multiply this by 3 is a real one. We can't measure it. It is guesswork. And I'm going to show you why I think the guesswork is wrong. Because you see, for the last 420,000 years, there has been hardly any change in global temperatures. Yes, as you can see, there are 4 periods there before the present period when the weather was warmer than normal. These are called interglacial warm periods, like the one we're lucky enough to live in now. Each of the 4, you'll notice, previous interglacial warm periods were warmer than the present, going back 420,000 years. So there's nothing particularly special about today's temperatures in the geological time. But the interesting thing about this record is that it varies only by 3 Celsius, or 1% in absolute terms, up or down from the long run median, the long run average. And that means it's very, very difficult to change global temperature at all, even if you get enormous changes, as you would have done over so long a period, in the orbital characteristics of the Earth. For instance, there is the obliquity of the Earth's axis with respect to the plane of the ecliptic. There is the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit. There is the precession of the equinoxes caused by the libration of the Earth's axis. These are the 3 Milankovitch cycles. Are you with me so far? No. No, I didn't think so. The point is, these are very, very big astronomical influences that cause the tilt of the Earth and its distance to the Sun to be different from what it is today. And because of these huge changes, we would expect that if there were big feedbacks operating in the system, then the changes in temperature that these huge astronomical changes would cause would be very much bigger than the ice core reconstructions of temperature show that they are. And what that indicates to me is the possibility that these feedbacks, which are the sole excuse for multiplying by 3 the very small and agreed direct warming from CO2, may not be all that they're cracked up to be. And I want to provide one further piece of evidence of this, and this is probably the most important slide in the whole thing. What this is I've plotted here the loop gain, the feedback loop gain as it's called, against the amount of warming you would get if you doubled CO2 concentration. And what you'll see is that it's a rather strange graph. It appears to be an exponential graph. It goes ever more rapidly upwards and away to infinity. And then suddenly, at a loop gain of unity, it goes the other way. And it comes right down here and causes as much cooling as a moment ago it was causing warming. Now, where does the equation of feedback amplification, the mutual feedback amplification, come from? It comes not from the climate, but from electronic circuitry. In a book of 551 immensely tedious but very, very informative pages by R.W. Bode, published by Van Nostrand Reinhold in New York in 1945, about feedback amplification in electronic circuits. And what happens in an electronic circuit is that the voltage, which is their equivalent of the temperature, is amplified by the loop gain being pushed up towards unity. But the moment the loop gain goes above 1, then what happens is that the voltage, instead of going almost up to infinity in one direction, it plunges in the opposite direction and goes to the negative rail from the positive rail, as it's called. So in other words, this is a physically correct representation of what happens in an electronic circuit. But for two reasons, it can't apply in the climate. The first is that the climate is very temperature stable. I've just shown you that here. And therefore, you can't have big feedbacks in a system that's temperature stable, because in an electronic circuit, which is the analogy they use, so I'm going to borrow their analogy for the moment, there is a limit on the loop gain that you can have if you want the circuit to remain stable. And it's 0.1 loop gain. And therefore, the probable range of climate sensitivities is going to be below that 0.1 line. It's going to be to the left of it. And so you're going to get temperature change of between 1/2 and 1.3 Celsius degrees per doubling of CO2, if you follow the electronic theory that they themselves put forward. But look where the IPCC's range of estimates is, 2 to 4.5 Celsius of temperature change, and that implies that a loop gain, a concept of which the IPCC's authors are entirely unaware, incidentally, of between 0.42 and 0.74, with a central estimate of 0.64. Way, way, way too high to have given us the stable climate we've seen over the last 420,000 years. That is simply impossible. And therefore, the very high increases in temperature per doubling of CO2 that they posit are also impossible. But there's another reason why this equation can't apply in the climate, and this really is the killer reason. It is that there is no physical mechanism, as there is in an electronic circuit, by which as you push the temperature up, or rather you push the loop gain up above unity, suddenly the feedbacks that were pushing the temperature up suddenly push it down in the opposite direction. That applies in the electronic circuit, but it cannot happen in the climate because there is no physical process known to man by which it can. It is an impossibility. That equation is the wrong equation. And because it's the wrong equation, they have no justification anymore for multiplying the direct warming from CO2 by 3. And the entire case for alarm about the climate disappears with a loud pop. That's it. It's as simple as that. It's the wrong equation. Now, I put this result in a debate with Professor Bates, who is on the other side of the case on global warming. He has to be, because otherwise you lose your tenure. And we had a debate in front of the Law Society of Ireland in Galway about 15 months ago. And I showed this, and I gave this explanation. He was looking like this, and then there were one or two greenies there, and they said, Professor Bates, Lord Monckton says you're using the wrong equation to amplify the feedbacks. What do you say to that? So Professor Bates said, well, don't you be rude about Lord Monckton. He seems to know quite a lot about this. And he said, I have been thinking the same thing. There is worry now about this because they can see that we're not getting, in the short term, very much in the way of feedbacks. You wouldn't expect them, actually. But they're now beginning to realise that this equation simply won't do. And I only found it because I was reading very carefully through the fourth assessment report, and I found this equation buried in a footnote on page 631. That's how carefully you have to read this stuff to find out where the heffalump traps really are. Now, there's one more problem with the climate I'm going to look at. Then very quickly, what we're going to do is some climate economics, and then I'm going to finish, if that's all right, ladies and gentlemen. I'll take your questions very happily for about 20 minutes after that. Now, first of all, the cricket, like the climate, behaves as what is called in mathematics a chaotic object. And in Australia, I had great fun saying to them, who would have thought, for instance, that we would have, in England, not only won back the Ashes, but held on to them? Just thought I'd rub it in. They were furious. So, what I'm going to do is to show you that in an object like the climate behaves chaotically, there are a couple of lessons we can draw from the standard mathematics you'll find in any textbook of chaos theory. What I'm going to do is to take, as a heuristic again, an example from mathematics which we then apply a lesson to the climate from. This function, which is the function which codes for the Mandelbrot fractal set. Now this has nothing to do with the climate, it is just an example, a heuristic. And this simply says f of z maps to z squared plus c, where c is a complex number. I'm sure you all understand perfectly what this equation is saying. And what we're going to do is we're going to make the equation draw a picture. Because what you hear from the Greens is, oh, but you see, if the planet warms, they're all talking this kind of baby language, if the planet warms, then there's going to be a tipping point. And everything is going to go to hell in a handcuff. It's all going to be terrible, a tipping point. Now, no mathematician would talk of a tipping point. What he would talk about is a bifurcation, or a phase transition, if you're old-fashioned, in the evolution of the chaotic object. And these bifurcations will happen all over the place and rather unexpectedly, unless you know to a very great precision the values of all of the relevant parameters that define the object you're examining at any point in time, known to mathematicians as t0, the starting point of your study of the evolution of the object. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to get this equation to draw a picture on the screen, pixel by pixel. The value of c for the top left pixel and for the bottom right pixel are shown at top left and bottom right respectively. You will see that the digits in green are identical between the two values of c to 12 or even 13 decimal places. These are more or less identical. It's rather like not changing the temperature by more than a thousandth of a degree Celsius. Will we get tipping points? Will we get extreme weather events? Will we get sudden departure from the steady state that we get used to in the climate? Will it suddenly go all over the place? I'm going to represent each tipping point by a change in colour in the picture this equation is going to draw. And now we're going to have some fun, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to have an auction. Will anyone like to start the bidding by saying how many changes in colour we're going to see? Just name a figure, don't be shy. You don't have to be right about this, there'll be no detention if you get it wrong.
5.
5, thank you. I'm bid.
4.
We have an opening bid, that's an underbid, madam. Sorry, we already bid 5. You have to go high. Anybody going to go high? 6 over here, anybody in advance on 6? 6 going once, going twice?
100.
7, 100? Who said 100? Why did you say 100? Well, in fact, I'm going to close the auction at 100. Thank you very much. It's billions. So you all underbid, and I get the prize. And this is it. Now, that is not me with my paint pots, I assure you. It is that equation that drew that picture. You have to do something like 250,000 calculations for each individual pixel. So it took quite a bit of time to put this picture together for you. But there it is. And what this shows is that even if you hardly change the temperature at all, as it were, then you're still going to get just as many tipping points as if you don't. So that means that if you get a flood or a drought here in New Zealand, you cannot blame these extreme weather events on global warming, because you're just as likely to get tipping points even if you hardly change the climate at all as if you change it a lot. That's the first lesson from chaos theory. And the other one is very simpler. It is reliable long-term prediction of future climate states is simply not possible by any method because the object behaves chaotically, unless you have such a precise knowledge of the value of each of the millions of variables that define the climate, that you can get a reliable forecast. Even if you could get that, which we can't, then it would take from here until the end of the universe to make a single 10-year climate forecast. That's why using models to try to tell you what climate says is going to do is simply impossible. It can't be done. So now we're going to draw the scientific conclusion very briefly, which is that climate modeling has now failed its key test. Models exaggerate warming and its effects because they grossly overstate those feedbacks, and they're using the wrong equation, and that's why they overstate them. They underplay the influence of the uncertainty caused by the fact that the climate object behaves chaotically. You get things like Sandy, which had nothing to do with global warming, things like Beaufort, which had nothing to do with global warming. These things will suddenly happen. Your drought here, your Kerry floods, all of these things are not because of global warming, they're because the object behaves chaotically. And you need a very long period of study of the climate before you could discern any human influence on it at all. So the climate, in any case, is inherently temperature stable. It's very, very difficult to get the temperature of the Earth to change long term, and therefore there is no cause for alarm, scientifically speaking, at all. And that's the end of the science, in more respects than one. There's going to be a lot of people out of jobs when this becomes rather better known. Well, now the next question is the economical one. Because at this point, often in my presentations, somebody will say, from the Greens, they say, but what if you're wrong? And I'll say, well, I've just given a very detailed presentation with scientific analyses, graphs, data, equations even. Is there some particular point at which you fear that I have departed from the straight and narrow road of truth? What if you're wrong? Okay, I'm going to be Mr. Nice Guy. I'm going to assume that everything that I've said to you, just for the sake of argument, has been wrong so far. And that therefore the UN's climate panel is right. There's going to be their central estimate, 3 Celsius of warming this century. That's their central estimate. Now, there's virtually nobody now that believes it's going to be as high as that. Dr. Miles Allen from Oxford, right in the tank for the global warming faction, has been saying until recently we're going to see 5 Celsius of warming this century. They're all bidding themselves up, who can give the biggest forecast of global warming. Who's the one with the big swinging, whatever it's called. And so they're all being, anyway, 5. Just last week, he came out and said, actually, after 17 years without global warming, I don't see how it can be possibly anywhere near 2. So they're all climbing down out of the tree one by one, ladies and gentlemen. It is falling apart. But Mr. Nice Guy is going to assume, for the sake of argument, that we're going to see 3 Celsius of warming this century by 2100. That's the central estimate of the UN's climate panel. We're also going to assume that the cost of letting that warming happen, just not doing anything about it, is every bit as high as the Stern report of 2006, the consensus report done for the British government by a socialist, is right. He says, if you get the central estimate of 3 Celsius warming, which was the central estimate then and remains the central estimate now, then that's going to cost 1.5% of the value of all the goods and services we produce worldwide for the whole of the century. Quite a lot of money. Now, how does he come to so extremely large a figure? Well, he does this because he assumes, that you can credit this now, but the assumption that he did in that report was that there was a 1 in 10 chance that because of global warming caused by us, the whole world would come to an end by 2100. I kid you not. They called me stupid. And that's what he said. He said, a 1 in 10 chance of the world coming to an end because of global warming caused by, oh, come off it. But that was the assumption on which he chose this figure. So by rights I should reduce that figure. But I am Mr. Nice Guy. I'm going to accept that figure for the sake of argument. Let's accept there might be 3 Celsius warming. Let's accept 1.5% of GDP as the cost of letting that warming happen and having to pay the cost of adaptation to any damage or rising sea levels or all the other floods, plagues, locusts, boils, pustules, infestations that you hear them. I mean, it's such fun being on the other side. You can just ramp it up. I mean, James Hansen's been saying sea level is going to rise by 246 feet. No, it isn't. Actually, it's going to rise by 2,468 feet. So mine is bigger than yours. So there. It's lovely, you know, you can have such fun doing it. But anyway, that's their figures. I'm going to accept their figures for the sake of argument, and we are going to now do an intertemporal economic investment appraisal of Australia's carbon tax. I can't do it for New Zealand's ETS, partly because you're linked to the mad European scheme, and so one can't tell what the price of a tonne of carbon is going to be from one moment to the next, but it's somewhere between $2.80 and $5 at the moment. And it's not much of a disincentive, frankly, to emit carbon, so you're not going to make any difference to your carbon footprint by having an ETS, it's just another tax. But in Australia, they've got a bigger one than you. They've got $25 a tonne and $500 a tonne for methane. So seriously crippling their industries one by one. What we're going to do is to look at Australia's tax for one good reason. That is that they, because they had a really tough opposition there, they had a proper debate about it, and they smoked out from the government what the costs and benefits were going to be. And I'm going to just go through these with you now, doing a few calculations of my own, each of which is entirely uncontroversial. There is nothing in any way unusual about any of this. Now, at most now, they're going to manage to reduce their carbon emissions by 5% over the 10 years of the scheme. But Australia's emissions are only 1.2% of global emissions. So that means that the total global emissions that will be abated after 10 years of the carbon tax compared with not having one will be a non-particularly thrilling 0.06%. A simple calculation which until I did it nobody had done. Then we're going to look at what the CO2 concentration is going to be after 10 years with the tax if you're only going to reduce the emissions by 0.06%. And the answer is 409.988 compared with the 410 that it would otherwise be, microatmospheres. 410 without the carbon tax, 409.988 with it. We're on the way to global cooling, chaps. So now what we're going to do is to work out how much global warming the Australian carbon tax would achieve if it worked as it's now expected to work and reduce the emissions by 5%. And it would be 0.00005 Celsius, 1/20,000th of a Celsius degree. None of this is controversial. All of these are the UN's own equations I'm using here. They're not very particularly difficult ones either. And that means that we can't even measure this change because that's that's 1/1000th of the minimum temperature change that we are capable of measuring with modern instruments, because there's an uncertainty of a 20th of a degree, so a 20,000th of a degree. So even if this worked as well as they wished it to, we would have no means of measuring that it had. And the cost of achieving that 1/20,000th of a Celsius degree of warming is $162 billion. And that means that the cost of forestalling just one of the 3 Celsius of warming that is predicted to happen by the IPCC this century, if we all had carbon taxes globally, is a modest $3.2 quadrillion. Now that's so large a figure, it's a bit difficult to get our minds around it. So let's just imagine how much warming we would prevent if we just wanted to forestall the 1/7th of a Celsius degree of warming that the UN's climate panel, as its central estimate, forecast will happen in the 10 years that the scheme for the carbon tax is supposed to run. And the answer, of course, is $450 trillion, still too big a number to get our minds around. So let's work out what that would be if we divided it up among all 7 billion people on Earth. And it would be $65,000 per head over the next 10 years just to forestall 1/7th of a Celsius degree of warming. Sir, I'll have your cheque now, please. Certainly. Where's your chequebook? I want to see the colour of your money. Aren't you willing to save the planet? He seems curiously coy, ladies and gentlemen. There is an extreme reluctance. Oh, there's somebody who wants to offer a cheque. Come along.
As long as I know where that money is going.
Well, it's going into my pocket, of course.
No.
You know, I'm a carbon
Going
trader.
overseas.
So, there we are, $65,000 a head. That will buy you your stabilisation of global temperature this decade. And that period. So, 67% of the global GDP over this 10-year period. So, 67% of GDP is the cost of taking action to make global warming go away if we all had carbon taxes like Australia's. 1.5% of GDP is the cost of doing nothing, going out into the garden, enjoying the sunshine, going surfing, and paying the later and lesser cost of adaptation to any global warming that happens without spending a single red cent now.
Can you explain
And that
the
means it's
difference?
45 times more expensive to act now
Can you explain the
on
difference
global
between
warming
carbon tax
than
and
it is
carbon trading?
to... I'm sorry?
Can you explain the difference between carbon tax and...
Yes, I'll be delighted to do that at the end. So 45 times more expensive to act now on global warming than to let it happen and pay the later cost of adaptation the day after tomorrow, to borrow a phrase. You can see that that is absurd. And yet, every step of that calculation is in front of you. There's nothing concealed. I'm not hiding anything behind my back. That is the real answer. And it is a peer-reviewed result. It's being published in the 45th annual proceedings of the World Federation of Scientists. So this is the ballpark that we're in. You could push the numbers a little bit either way, but it's not going to alter the fact that it's many times more expensive, perhaps 100 times more expensive, to act now We're assuming that the amount of warming they predict is right and the cost of dealing with it is right. They're probably exaggerating on both counts. In that case, you're looking at maybe 150 times more expensive to act now. And not 150% more, 150 times more. So the economic conclusions are very straightforward. No policy to abate global warming by taxing, trading, regulating, reducing, replacing or sequestering CO2 will be cost effective solely on grounds of the welfare benefit from climate mitigation. You'd have to have some other reason for doing this, like they're bust and they need the money. CO2 mitigation strategies that are inexpensive enough to be affordable will be ineffective. If they're expensive enough to be effective, they will be unaffordable. Focused adaptation is better. And here's one from the London insurance market, which is worth remembering. If the premium is 45 times the cost of the risk you're insuring against, don't take out insurance. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a precautionary principle worthy of the name. And there I must leave it because I have another meeting shortly. I am happy to take some questions now. Thank you all very much. Yes, sir.
Monckton, I think you should be aware that in New Zealand we've adopted a trading scheme which anyone with half a brain can see is simply setting up another casino like the futures market.
That's right.
For the big people overseas to speculate in. And the dangers for us are, well, as a forester, I see it as grabbing control of all the timber in the world.
Yes.
It's probably connected with the next thing that's going to be speculated in, and that's water,
Yes.
which will come into it. But it's so easy to see that it's a racket. The Aussies may have a bit of sense. If they're going to do it, they're doing it with an honest tack. We're not. We're going to go the trendy way and give away our sovereignty.
Yes, and this does lead on to the question the honourable gentleman asked me earlier, just behind you, and that is, what's the difference between the two? Now, a carbon tax is you set a straightforward rate of how much money you're going to charge for the right to emit each tonne of carbon, and you levy the tax on that. And it's a very straightforward mechanism. It's also very crippling, as Australia's industries are finding very much to their cost. The rate of bankruptcies in Australia is now at record levels. It's really terrifying what's happening. The whole economy is imploding. And whereas if you have a trading scheme, then what you do is they like to call this a market mechanism. Of course, it's not a market mechanism at all, because the price is rigged. And if you rig a market, the people who benefit are the people who rig the market and nobody else. So it's not a real market. It's just another way of taking money out of people. And what you do is you have a huge international exchange on which the right to buy, the right to emit a tonne of carbon are bought and sold at whatever the market price for that day is. Now, we've tried this in the EU, you've got it here. In the you're tied to the EU scheme, very stupidly, because the EU scheme, which started out at, I think, around, I forget now, something like $10 or $20 a tonne, has come down recently to $2.80 a tonne. I think it's about $5 a tonne at the moment.
And big business can go on polluting and just
oh, absolutely.
pay for it and pass the cost on.
Precisely. It's basically all of this. It doesn't very much matter what you do. You know, if you are simply stirring 10 tonnes of parrot droppings, it doesn't matter whether you do that with a carbon tax or whether you do it with a trading scheme. You'll still end up with 10 tonnes of parrot droppings stirred. None of this works or makes any sense economically, because although I did the figures for a carbon tax there, if I were to do similar figures for the EU ETS, which you're tied to, then you'd get much the same output. You have to do the calculation in a slightly different way, but it leads to very much the same. All of the paper which is being published on this, if anyone wants a copy, I can send it to them. That does do, I think, something like 8 case histories, one of which is the European ETS. And you can see that that too is not a vast improvement on the Australian scheme. And all of these schemes, remember, depend upon their assertion of how much carbon emissions worldwide they will remit by having these schemes. I've taken their figures as being correct. I don't think they are correct. I don't think Australia is going to reduce its carbon emissions by 5% compared to what they otherwise would have been. That's what they're trying to pretend. They were originally going for 20%. They're not going to get that. They might get 5%. But it all depends on what they say is going to happen, because so inexplicit are all the figures on this. Australia's is the best one I could do because it has more figures than on most. I was able to do a bit on the European ETS as well, because again, our government has asked some fairly tough questions about it, so we've got some data on that. But the New Zealand one, I was looking at one particular aspect before I was trying to calculate it, and it said, and the government in its quest for openness has published the following figures. The cost of this particular item will be brackets deleted. The cost of that item will be brackets deleted. And I thought, this? Open government? Anyway, as you can see, I couldn't obviously do any calculations on the basis of a government which is obviously running very scared of the monster it has unleashed and is not willing to tell anyone how much it really costs. But it will not be significantly different from the cost-benefit analysis I've just done for the carbon tax. There's no real difference between the two. Yes?
Yeah, does the New Zealand Insurance Council accept your views that there's no climate change with regard to insurance?
Well, as I think I've tried to tell you, I don't care. I don't get my science from the New Zealand Insurance Council. I get it straight off the satellites. And I then do my own calculations to work out the trends.
Yeah, that'd be very thorough.
And I also listen to what the head of the UN's science panel has said. And he has said there's been no global warming for 17 years. Now, I'm sorry, you need to have that argument with him and not with me. I've done the calculations and I've showed you how I've done them. I've showed you data source after data source, and that is what I've shown. And if you get your science from an organisation which would no doubt like to profit from hiking premiums in the name of frightening people about the climate scare, which is what our insurance companies are doing in London, then I'm sorry, but they have the same vested interest you have in making money out of this nonsense. And that's why they take the line they do. And what I've done is to show you data set after data set after data set. And if you can't understand what a data set is, or how to determine a least squares linear regression trend on it, or how to allow for the measurement uncertainty in the data, then go back to horticultural school and learn a little bit of science. Because what I've done is to give you a scientific presentation, ladies and gentlemen. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I have a graph here which depicts how the atmosphere warms.
Yes.
According to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yes.
At 20 parts per million,
yeah,
the warming is about 1.5 degrees centigrade.
Yes.
At 40 parts per million, it is 0.3 degrees centigrade.
Yes.
By the time it gets to 400, I can't read it, it's so low.
That's right. What you're looking at there is a slightly naive plot of the logarithmicity of the temperature response, or the forcing response, strictly speaking, which then feeds through to the temperature response of adding CO2 to the atmosphere. Now, what a logarithmic relation means is that as you add each new molecule of CO2, it will cause some warming, but it will cause less warming than all the previous molecules that were added. It's a diminishing returns case. And you're quite right to point out that as we are now at just about 400 parts per million, the diminishing returns are really quite severe. And that means that if you had a doubling of CO2 concentration, you would expect 3.708 watts per square metre of radiative forcing. That is 5.35 times the natural logarithm of 2, which is 0.693. Multiply those two, you get 3.708 watts per square metre. And then if you multiply that by the instantaneous climate sensitivity parameter, which is the one which doesn't allow for any feedbacks, then that's 0.3125 Kelvin per watt per square metre. Then the amount of warming you would expect to get per doubling of CO2, just as the basic warming before you allow for feedbacks, is going to be 1.16 Celsius. If you then allow for feedbacks at the rate which the UN's climate panel predicts, then your climate sensitivity parameter rises from 0.3125 to 0.879 Kelvin per watt per square metre. Multiply that in turn by the radiative forcing of 3.708 watts per square metre, and the warming you get is 3.26, plus or minus 0.69 Kelvin, the 0.69 being the measurement uncertainty. And that in turn you will find, because you want references for all this, you won't want to just believe it from me when I do these figures, you need to go to page 798 of the UN's fourth assessment report, the physical science basis. That's volume 1 of the 3 volumes. You'll need to go to chapter 10, and you go to the top of page 798, and you'll find box 10.2, and you go 4 or 5 lines down from the top, and you'll find that figure. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
thing that strikes me particularly about the climate change argument is it's all very short term. And the shorter the term, the more rapid the changes are going to be. And we really ought to be considering climate over the lifetime of the Earth, or at least the last 10,000 years.
Well, I think that is certainly true. One should take a long view on this, as I have done in going back over 420,000 years to look at the very small changes in temperatures we've seen. And I wouldn't expect to see very much warming as a result of CO2 in this century. My best guess, and I stress, I'm not going to try and pretend that I have a complex computer model to use, a very simple one. But my guess is that we'll be looking at around 1 Celsius of warming this century, which is well within the natural variability of the climate. We couldn't even tell that it was caused by us, but that's what I would expect us to contribute to warming this century. Now, on the other side of that equation, the sun is becoming less active, and according to the best estimates of the solar physicists, is going to be considerably less active over the next 60 years. That will countervail to some extent, as it already is, against the human contribution, and the net effect will be pretty small. So the main thing is, ladies and gentlemen, get out and enjoy the sunshine. Don't worry, the scare is over.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you once again for coming. As I say, whether you're for or against the argument, I really appreciate Christopher for actually putting an alternative view. You can make your own mind up, and we're off to Dickens' conference room, so if you want to see him there, most welcome.
Come again.
In the meantime, Esther is happy. She's got a lot of books. She's got Ian Wishart's Aircon book, that's an excellent New Zealand book, written by a New Zealand writer about New Zealand conditions. So yeah, just go for it, guys.
Thank you very much.